episode of my podcast project for covering gender and wargaming. We're going to talk about playing different war games, painting, community, and identity, one bit at a time. I am your host, Lil, and today I'm really excited because I get to introduce not just an amazing member of our local wargaming community here in central Pennsylvania, but also someone who's really close to my heart, my girlfriend Hannah. She is the only member of this podcast series that I am including who is not a figure on social media or is involved in content creation. When I think about why a space like this matters and why it matters to have women, specifically trans women like Hannah, leading and thriving in games like Warhammer that is traditionally thought as a competitive space and a very masculine space, I think about gender studies, and I immediately knew what I wanted to do and write about, even when I first scheduled this class. So there is this fascinating study by Johnson and colleagues back in 2006 that found that war games and other competitive strategic simulations of battle tend to reward over confidence, aggression, and other stereotypical ideas of masculinity. The whole high risk, high reward thing really was pushed, and being in that environment, peers would tend to push each other and encourage each other to do the more risky thing. It's really mob mentality if you think about it. It's not something neutral. It's shaped by our cultural experiences of what it means to be a strong man, competing, winning, dominating. And that's not for everyone. That's not even for a lot of men. Not for the majority of people that play war games. And when you realize that, you see that a lot of our gaming spaces weren't built for everyone. They were built around these ideas, the competitive and exclusive nature of war and of these very militaristic environments. When we look around now at war games, we look to people like Hannah, and we see that narrative getting broken apart. We see people showing up and playing, building community, not needing to mirror these old, narrow stereotypes of who belongs at the table. She's carving out her own space. She is a leader here. Our community wouldn't be what it is without her. She's building our own league right now at a game store in Carlisle, and I couldn't be happier to see her outside of the box, really out there and building. It's really bold to do something like this, especially as an out trans woman, which she's not in every environment, and I think that's why wargaming is really special for us. So, another piece that really made me think about this was one by Gandolfi and Schiambo. I feel really bad, I'm probably pronouncing both of those wrong, but their work in 2018, they wrote about how women characters are represented in war games, strategy games, and video games through silence. Especially strong women are written like this. Their study specifically is looking at the character Quiet from Metal Gear Solid 5, but these characters are narratively presented as mute, and that relates to one of the factions that we talk about in Warhammer, the Sisters of Silence, that are warriors that swear an oath of silence and have strong psychic powers. They're seen but not heard, like a lot of women should be. They're secondhand to their traditionally male counterparts, which we learn later in this episode that maybe not all of those counterparts in the big bulky armor are male. And maybe that made some old dude bros upset. So we're gonna jump into that kind of Twitter discourse stuff later too. But when you're talking about real people, real women, they're not silent. Historically, a lot of trans women gamers and women who are existing in male spaces in general are treated the same way. Tolerated if they just don't make a noise, make a uproar. If they didn't, what's a president spaces, especially if they don't win. They don't want you to win. I'm saying Nike's new tagline, but hey, they don't. You can't win. But Hannah doesn't do quiet. She is smart, she's strategic, she's organizing a whole league in our community. She is pushing for inclusive events. She is not asking for permission to belong here. She just is here. And this is why representation matters. Not just who gets to play, but who gets to lead. And who gets to decide what kind of space that this hobby can be. So today we're going to talk with Hannah about her journey into wargaming, how we got into it together, about her challenges, victories, and the actual work and structural rules behind these spaces, and how she is hoping that it's somewhere everyone can show up and not just believe the stuff being spouted on the internet. We'll talk about leadership, the culture of competition, which we'll get even more to in a later episode, and about how strategy can be a form of care and testing yourself, not just wanting to dominate others. And of course, we'll nerd out about minis and lore and how to keep a league running, because it's not just about games, it's about community. And that is the main point of this episode of the Bitz Box. So let's jump right in. Here's Hannah. Just because I want us to be naturally talking.
What's naturally talking?
Like,
Am I talking naturally now? What do I do?
don't
I'm
talk
being
like
silly.
that. Okay. Alright.
Should I pause my game?
I mean, you can game throughout as long as you can answer.
I might pause my game in a little bit.
Alright. Before I get ahead of myself, everyone else has this more written intro, but I want you to kind of talk about yourself and what is your niche within the hobby. Who are you?
I'm Hannah.
Yes.
I guess my niche within the hobby is I am more focused on the actual game part of the hobby, which to those uninitiated might sound a little weird.
Yeah.
Like you say your hobby is wargaming. What do you mean that some people whose hobby is wargaming aren't super involved with the game? But I mean, there's multiple elements of, some people are in it just to read the books and discuss the lore, and some people paint the miniatures and treat it as more like an artistic thing. Definitely engage with some parts of the hobby. Don't have to pick just one. But yeah, I primarily play the game. Um, I do build most of our models. And I paint a couple of them. I've been trying to paint more. Um,
Yeah.
I'd also say I'm becoming sort of an organizer with right now I'm in the middle of setting up a crusade, which is a series of narrative games played amongst a group. And I don't really have a set goal, but in the future I would love to organize events and potentially maybe do some TOing, tournament organizing,
Yeah. So I kind of want to take a step back and ask you, like, I know, but like to explain to a wider audience of particularly for this like initial series that I'm doing that are not into wargaming or know nothing about wargaming. How did you first learn about it and get into it?
I first learned about it through a video game, specifically a mobile game. Um, I think it's called like Freeblade. You
I've
take
never heard of
control
that one.
of Yeah, you take control of an Imperial Knight, and it's like an on-rail shooter where you're dropped into a planet of orcs and you go on missions and destroy orcs. Um, and I'm like, wow, this is really cool. When I looked up Warhammer on the App Store, and I'm like, whoa, there's more than just this app.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about it with my friend at school. And I'm like, dude, there's like all these Warhammer things. You ever hear of this? And he's
What
like,
is this?
yeah, it's like this massive tabletop war game. And at the time, like, I think like most people, like tabletop war game, you think of like, a bunch of dads sitting in a basement with their little World War II army figures, um, bolt action.
Yeah.
Uh, I've now since learned that is the main game for
Yeah.
people of
There's
that
a lot of
age.
historical games, and I think that's its own questionable environment, but
There's there's good and
there's
bads.
good. Oh, yeah.
Um,
Oh, yeah.
but yeah, he told me about it, and all I really learned about it was that it is complicated and expensive to get into. So I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really look further into it um, until I don't remember what caused it to come up. Um, Not long after we started dating, I mention it, and you're like, "This sounds really cool." You start doing a bunch of research into it, and then
Yeah.
just like out of the blue, I get a message. Hey, look what I just ordered off of eBay, and you bought some of the first models for your first army.
Yeah.
This was Battle Adeptus Sororitas,
I
and
immediately spent $200 off the bat after a night of research. I think it came up because I was talking about miniature painting D&D models, which I hadn't
yes,
even done at that point. I just was so interested in like miniature painting, and honestly a lot of D&D models out there, they look like shit. They do.
they do.
They do, and the
Um,
GW, the Games Workshop Warhammer sculpts were beautiful.
oh yeah,
And
I
they
mean,
really are very leading in this space, and there's a lot of independent creators out there, but I was very captured by them. I think one of the hardest parts for me, and we're going to kind of wrap around back into some gender and some more cultural studies topics, but um, one of the most difficult things for me was differentiating between the different Warhammer settings at the start and going, okay, this is Warhammer 40k, this is Sigmar, this is Old World, like traditional fantasy, and all those worlds. Because a lot of the sculpts are very similar, and there's a lot of similar groups within them. Like you have
I
elves
mean,
and
some of the groups
orcs,
are
but
just the same.
some of them are just the same. Yeah, like the demons are just the same models.
Other chaos aligned ones that you can't, but all the demon ones you can.
Yeah, and so it's a lot of rules. Um, is a big thing. I think that's somewhere we see a lot of gender divide. You'll see tournament games online from all these like male channel, like very traditionally rules heavy, crunchy, no explanation stuff, and then you'll go to painting channels that are much more like towards women and like other gender diverse folks, and I think you see a lot more acceptance there in general, but even in like the painting community, you'll get still some of the like nitty gritty painting tutorials, very, I don't know how to describe it. People that are more masculine are definitely drawn towards those very challenging parts of the hobbies. And so I kind of want to know like what aesthetics like really have grabbed you in this hobby, and how is it like being a woman, being a trans woman, and kind of like a leader in your space that is mostly male?
What very first grabbed me when I saw that first mobile game was big robot shooting things, very cool. When it came to
Yes, of
actually
course.
expanding onto the tabletop, um, I think part of it was a mix of the art aesthetic, um, the sci-fi world with so many varied, interesting alien creatures and all the different space marines. Um, the art immediately draws you in, and the gameplay itself, I it's just it was so foreign, and I love, strategy games, tactical games. I love, puzzle solving. So having this big board with lots of different elements, variables, strategies, um, I love deconstructing that and treating it like a puzzle and trying to solve things. So that's what drew me to the gameplay,
Because
and I think
you're very, like,
it's
again, puzzle oriented, but
mhm.
again, there's this other competitive nature to Warhammer that is kind of hard to ignore at moments, too.
I think it is and isn't. I think part of that is like people needing to get over themselves a little bit.
Hmm.
Like all Games Workshop gives you for Warhammer is this set of rules um, for how to play a game, and there's a tournament companion, and there is a crusade companion. One is, tournament companion, of course, for organized tournament play, the crusade companion for narrative play. Um, but if you're not playing a tournament and if you're not doing a crusade, you're kind of free to do whatever you want with your models.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think
and
that's
a
what a
lot
lot
of people,
of. Sorry.
you're good. I think we're going to kind of say the same thing where a lot
Yeah.
of people, if you're just organizing a one-off game between two people, that looks more like what's in the tournament companion than in the crusade book. So people just kind of automatically want to play very competitively, um, instead of maybe enjoying the narrative of the battle that you're about to play in.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Which I think narrative games are intimidating, at least to me in a different kind of way. Of being like, what
Mhm.
if this doesn't play out how I'm imagining or how it is in lore, that sort of thing. But it really is just trying things, trying different formats. And I think I'm also taking an approach here as someone on the outside looking in for this project because I think a lot of people have that association of what like the tabletop gaming space is. And when you actually go in the stores, it doesn't look like that. So I kind of want to wrap back around to my other part of your question is what is it like what have your experiences been being a woman in this space in our local space and online spaces? How does that look for you?
Yeah, those two groups definitely very different.
Yeah,
Um,
but not how you
when it
think.
comes to yeah, when it comes to local spaces, genuinely like gender never really comes up like as a matter of contention of like someone saying this is a boys game or like the most I can think of is when I've noticed something when people are like greeting people or adding them like trying to initiate people into the hobby, people will sometimes treat women um, as being more clueless and more ignorant to how things work,
Yeah.
which there is some truth behind that stereotyping of, a lot of women, because, these hobbies are generally aimed and marketed towards men. Oftentimes they don't have as much experience, but you know, having neighboring experiences with other board games and video games, which have become more, more widely marketed to all genders. A lot of that does translate, and sometimes it can be a little condescending when people are talking to women about,
Yeah,
starting the game. But especially like once people are established and you're playing with your friends, it doesn't really matter. Um, like in my personal experience, I can only think of like one or two times playing with like a random person where I felt, I don't know if this person's, the coolest about my identity, but when you're playing in a public shop space, um, and you like if you're playing Warhammer, so much work goes into building your army, painting your army, learning your rules.
oh yeah,
There's almost like you might not, people kind of leave a lot of personal stuff at the door, and like, we can both recognize how much has been put into this hobby by both of us. And even if we might not want to be friends outside of this game right here, we're going to, play the game and enjoy ourselves.
for sure.
Uh,
um and I think, at least in our experience, we've gone to a couple different shops around central, southern Pennsylvania, even into like upper Maryland. Um,
mhm.
and we have had a pretty good experience. I mean, other than for me with some accessibility concerns, which is a whole different ballgame, but
Yeah.
I think most of the like in person places are really great, really accepting, especially the place that we go to the most. But it's a lot different online when you see people like saying wokehammer and that they need to start gatekeeping Warhammer in a way. But I don't think that's the majority of people.
Definitely not. Definitely a very vocal minority.
Yeah,
And I think it's important to give people a little bit of context as to Warhammer originally, and I people argue how effective it is in the modern setting at exploring these ideas, but originally was a satire where, you know, it was all making fun of like fascist ideologies where you have these xenophobic space marines cleansing alien races in the name of the emperor,
yeah,
and they evoke a lot of Roman iconology and like might makes right, and that all originally was like a big, sci-fi satire of fascism. And like this game has a lot of very progressive roots, and these people that, you know say like wokehammer, or like people that fight any sort of like progressive push in this space are usually the ones that don't understand that
yeah.
original meaning.
And I think I at least hope that this prevalence of people online that are at least, and in some circles, it's like primarily making fun of these really gatekeepy, rules lawyery people, which there's a much more adherence to the rules, and I think that actually helps a lot of people. But
Mhm.
I just hope it doesn't keep people, gender diverse people, away from the hobby.
Yeah,
Um,
it's yeah, that's a sad thing to imagine, people being kept out of this hobby. Like Games Workshop themselves, um, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was 2 or 3 years ago that TOs are now supposed to DQ people for misgendering trans opponents.
yeah, I was I need to admit, like, I was surprised in a good way when I heard that. It's not something I would have
Yeah,
expected, but I think, one, speaks to the company's integrity, in well, at least one way. They're definitely not perfect, but
No.
and two, the prevalence of people that use pronouns that might not appear to be the binary pronouns that are playing in tournaments, which is something I think is super cool because the majority of people that I've met um, that like are tournament players are cis men, and the majority of people that are outside of cis male identities usually are more casual or don't even play at all, are just painting and collecting. So I think that's super cool as well. But I kind of have another question that I'm interested on your answer of, um,
Yeah.
which is why do trans women specifically navigate towards um, not even just Warhammer, but like strategy gaming in general? I feel like I have met so many trans women, and there's so many very large creators out there too that are specifically trans women. So I'm interested on why you think there's that relationship.
I mean, I can't, I'm not a sociologist. I can't make a definitive judgment on this,
No.
but I think part of it is, that upbringing of like at least for me, I had like this identity of like, I liked the masculine things, but I didn't like being masculine, and it was a tough thing to navigate. And things like video
Yeah.
games were like a great middle ground where, I could do the guy thing and also enjoy myself. Um, and that sort of like that isolation pushes you into nerd spaces because nerd spaces not only, do you get to hide there from people socially, but also nerd spaces are generally very accepting and have become even more accepting in the past decade, um, to
For sure.
all sorts of sexualities, gender non-conforming people. Um, so it's just kind of like as a kid that these areas were safe for me, and that sure just like developed this love of, you know, of puzzles, of video games, of strategy. And I can't speak for all trans women in that, but I think a lot of trans women had a similar experience of being pushed into nerd spaces,
Yeah.
either for, safety or comfort. Um, and that just kind of sticks with you. And I don't want to say that as like a bad thing because I love being in nerd spaces, but that would be
No.
my best guess is these spaces are safe and are engaging hobbies that you can kind of stay safe in.
Yeah. I think about that a lot too, where I'm like, if I had a different identity or different abilities, like I wouldn't have been pushed to where I am now, doing the things I love, meeting amazing people, um, meeting you.
Yeah,
Um, and I think there's something really, really beautiful about that. Um, and I think it's interesting because I think Warhammer and wargaming on the tabletop, people wouldn't think it like provides the level of escapism as other things, as like video games where you create your custom character or D&D with roleplay. But when you're in it, going through those rules, let me tell you, it is a form of escapism.
yeah. It's and I think also it's like when you talk about, people you're not creating a character, you don't express yourself that way. There is a lot of ways to express yourself in the hobby through the art side of things where like part of Warhammer is like people creating their own personal like sub factions of groups because like it's said by GW, it's like these galaxies are so big and vast that like your little home, side project sub space marine chapter of like I don't know, the goober grunts, whatever. I don't know. Like, they could exist because the world's so big and there's so much space for all these things to exist.
Yeah.
Um, you can, like, my first army of it's a faction called the Thousand Sons, and part of their lore is one of the leaders of their faction made sort of a Faustian bargain, where to prevent this genetic defect within their ranks that sometimes cause them to warp and change into these grotesque demons, um, turned all of the non-sorcerer members of the faction to like this magical dust, and they are like, I don't know, they're these magical dust clouds piloting suits of armor, um barely human anymore. And I'm like, if they're barely human anymore, they don't care that much about gender. I'm making my army the Thousand Daughters, and they're all painted
Yeah.
the colors of the trans flag.
I was going to ask you to talk about that, so I'm glad it came up. And I think there's a lot of stuff like that people have done that's either like subtle or overt to
Hmm.
signal their identity in gaming. Um,
Definitely.
yeah, but I want to talk a little bit more, moving back to like canon stuff,
Mhm.
about the quote unquote controversy of let's start with the Adeptus Custodes. How about
An army I play.
an army you play? Let's for people that don't know, could you explain who the Emperor is and then who his custodians are?
Yes,
Very
so
simply.
the Emperor of Mankind is like the guy who piloted 10, yes, 10,000 years ago, piloted humanity to reach across the stars and colonize the entire galaxy. During an event called the Horse Heresy, he was grievously wounded and bound to this chair where he's basically on life support. And in the modern setting, he is worshipped, even though he's not conscious, barely alive. Um, he created it back 10,000 years ago, created the Space Marines and the Adeptus Custodes. The Space Marines are what we see, where they're these genetically modified soldiers. The Custodes are similar to the Space Marines, whereas they are, these genetically modified soldiers, but they were meant to be his like palace guard, his like
Yeah.
his space marines, and they were made through a different process. um and not only are they fierce warriors, they're also artisans and craftsmen. And he wanted to instill like all these other, like, other than just like fighting, he wanted them to be like people, and people that he could talk to and communicate with, sort of on his level. um
Yeah.
and the controversy that
Yes.
you were talking about is, for a very, very long time, the Custodes were always um, portrayed as men. Just like Space Marines are all men. And Space Marines have like some lore reason that I don't remember why he made them all men. Um, but the Custodes, they were made through a different process. So recently, the latest Custodes Codex, which is like an army expansion
Mhm.
during an edition, they have a couple short stories in there about Custodes that are women. And they they kind of just like made a statement like, there have always been women in the custodian guard. Like, they've always been there. They were made through a different process than Space Marines. Each one was handcrafted by the Emperor, and he crafted some of them to be women. And during this controversy, I think there were like a few instances that people had found in the past of like maybe like tiny mentions of custodian women existing in the past, but this was the first like big overt,
Yeah.
hey, there are women. And this coming so late along in the lore, basically, what I think, like, you can't say that it's not a retcon, even if maybe sometime in the past there was intentions for these women to exist. They didn't have a representation in any models on the
Yeah.
table. All the stories were about custodian men.
And they still
Um,
don't really have custodian specific models on the
mhm,
table. Do you kind of want to get into um well, sorry. Let's get into
you're good.
the Sisters of Silence and
Mhm.
who they are because in Warhammer we see a lot of female only groups.
Yes. Um, so the Sisters of Silence, when a human is born, they can be something that's called a blank. Correct me if I'm wrong, it means that
Mm-hmm.
they don't have a soul.
Um
It's
soul is a very
complicated.
specific word, but I think it's
Yeah.
basically they have a lack of what connects everyone to the warp, what connects everyone through psychic energy in the 40K universe.
Mhm. So they have this special ability to hunt demons and psychic creatures
Yes.
and not be affected by their psychic powers. Um, they take a oath of silence whenever they become a sister of silence, and they're just the emperor's psyker killers. Um, and they work very closely with the custodians. So that in the past there had sort of been this dynamic of, you know, of the Emperor's Guard, there's the women ones, which are the Sisters of Silence, and the men ones, which are the Adeptus Custodes.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and a lot of people are just like, why are you making them women? This is a betrayal of the lore. This is you kowtowing to the left, like you said earlier, woke hammer.
That
Um,
was yeah a big thing then. Because I think an argument then I heard from people trying to take a more what they thought was nuanced approach, a very like protecting under the guise of protecting women. They were like females becoming full custodian warriors. Custodians are like these 8 foot tall, like super beefy, bigger than your regular, already genetically modified space marine. People are like, well, this takes away from what makes Sisters of Silence special. They are the all female faction, kind of within the Custodes. Um, and I think that argument just kind of falls flat in a
yeah,
way. Because I
it,
think, yeah, sorry.
it's what didn't make them psycho special was that they were women. What made them special was that they hunted the psychic guys.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know.
So,
It's just like it feels like such a nothing that they're women now.
yeah. So, do you actually know in the lore why Sisters of Silence are all female?
Um, I don't quite
I
remember.
could I
I
could
thought
explain
it
it.
had. Yeah, you can explain it. I thought it had something to do with the men that were blanks were sent to do something else. That could be wrong.
No, I'm at least not seeing anything about that. Um, there have been certain things of people saying women have a higher rate of being blanks than men, but the main reason is the anathema psychona. If you remember that, the group of sanctioned psychers, so people who can use
Mhm.
psychic attacks within the universe, that they
Yes.
um, basically breed kind of almost clone-like versions of themselves and farm sanctioned psychers, as well as within these women, some of them are blanks that
Mhm.
study psychers within that order.
Oh, I did not know that.
So it's not that all blanks are female. I also think a really cool part about the Sisters of Silence is that they take an oath of silence and that they don't speak, which I
Hmm.
think you said you covered.
Yes.
And I remember when we were reading through a certain book, like them using um, almost like a version of sign language and having an interpreter. So I thought
Yes,
that was a
they do.
really, really cool inclusion. Um,
Yeah, it only really the Custodes and Sisters in Waiting, which are Sisters of Silence in training who have not yet taken the oath, know the sign language.
yes,
So that's why they need interpreters so often.
yeah. Um, so one thing you kind of touched on, um, Primarchs,
Yes.
the sons of the Emperor that he created. I think it was also some sort of gene seed cloning thing, which is the at least in universe explanation why they're all men. Um,
I
they
think if I remember
yes,
correctly, there was a reason why the Emperor chose for them all to be men. They could have been women because there is a statement by Malcador, the
yes,
right-hand man of the Emperor, in one of the later books of the Horus Heresy, where he goes, "I wish the Emperor had made them all women. They wouldn't have fought so much."
yeah,
Um,
yep, um, yeah, and I think a lot of people. There's also a figure that they refer to as the mother of the Primarchs, Urda, who um, basically it's revealed that she is part of the reason that they were scattered across the universe, not the Emperor, um, in a kind of way to protect them, so that the Primarchs were spread across the universe, grew up on different planets. None of them have mother figures except for one that we know of. Um, and so I think it's very interesting, kind of the way Warhammer has taken out like any maternal parenthood and even paternal parenthood. Like there is just no nurture in the Warhammer universe. And I do think it is a point to satire, but also a point just to make this setting seem so bleak, so grimdark as it's described. Um,
definitely.
so yeah, I want to talk about the not the Primarch specifically, but their quote unquote sons, the Space Marines.
Mhm.
Could you explain what is a Space Marine? The poster boys of 40K.
Yeah, so I did mention them briefly in the Custodes. They are, these genetically modified humans, much larger, up to sometimes like twice the height of a normal human almost. In some of the like larger cases. Uh, so the Emperor made his 20/18/9 sons, depending on which version of the history book you're reading. Uh, they're all made to be sort of clones of himself, but each he passed down a specific trait that he wanted them to inherit. Um, for some of them, like Magnus, it's his psychic ability. Some of them are a little more esoteric, where like Angron, it's his rage and anger, hence
Yeah,
Angron. They're very creative. Um,
very great.
uh, but then um, all of these Primarchs, they each have these legions of Space Marines that they are all created from this organ called the gene seed, which is
Which
kind of just like a
sounds
little,
disgusting,
yeah, it's
but it's an
it's like
organ.
this organ that's implanted into a person that turns them into a space marine,
Yes.
and they all inherit a measured, limited like version of the gifts of their Primarch.
Yeah.
Um,
And they also have a bunch of other stuff, like two lungs, multiple hearts. They're just supposed to be the peak of humanity. But they do come from regular humans.
Yes, they are, depending on the legion, generally they are selected from the homeworld of the Primarch to undergo the procedure to become Space Marines, uh, often including some sort of like hazing or military like basic training. Um, that in some cases is even very lethal to become a Space Marine, and I think it's all in service to like this sort of like making fun of this male power fantasy of these, meathead space marines
Hmm.
are the toughest, gruffest, dudes. But when you actually like read space, like read the novels, these space marines are often like very fragile and scared. They all they know is war and combat and nothing else.
Yeah, I was gonna
Um,
say that, like, getting into the books, it is so interesting how their programmed, like, lack of emotions actually causes a lot of issues for them. And that's, like, a huge part of what we
mhm,
talk about with men and masculinity in gender studies. And I think it's just that taken to, like, of course, the sci-fi 11th level, like, but yeah, it's very interesting.
yeah,
Like, I just think some of what we've read together has been actually really positive representations of masculinity, even though on the surface level, it seems like it would be the exact opposite.
I think there's a lot of good examples of both positive and negative masculine traits,
Yeah.
and at least of the books that we've read, I think they do a pretty good job, differentiating the two. And even though there aren't really any characters in the book that will condemn, these negatively masculine traits, I think you can see through the results,
Hmm.
what happens to these characters, that these negative these negative traits are like causing damage, they are hurting them. Um, Maybe to get in some more specifics, so we were reading through the Horse Heresy series, which is the prequel that I mentioned, 10,000 years before 40K, often referred to as 30K.
Hmm.
Um, and for the first couple books, we follow this character. His name is Loken, and we sort of watch this fall of the old guard, um, and getting usurped by this traitor movement against the emperor. And the emperor, I think we can both agree, is not a great guy. Um,
No.
but there were positive elements to like his doctrine, and what the space marines like,
Yeah,
this
just,
brotherhood was very healthy for them. Like they saw each other as family and they lifted each other up. But over time, you see this melt, this like familiar bond be destroyed by this power hungriness, this greed,
yeah.
this
I think one of the most
like,
interesting parts about what they want to destroy, which does still eventually end up happening, is the administrative state in
mhm,
Warhammer and how they talk about this mass of people that appear to do nothing and just sit on power. And I think that is very interesting and very apt in our political climate right now.
definitely,
Where it's like, yes, it is needed for some things, but abused in many other ways.
yeah. Like
Yeah.
one of the big plot points early on in the narrative is um So the Emperor has left the front lines of the Crusade, retreated back to Holy Terra, otherwise known as Earth. Um, and not long after, he sends out all of these artists who he refers to as remembrancers, set to remember the actions, the deeds that went on during the quote Great Crusade, humanity colonizing the galaxy. Um, and a lot of the Space Marines are very upset by this. These people, they got soft hands,
Mm-hmm.
Um, they they come to the front lines just to gawk and look while they are the practitioners of war. They do what they have to. They
Yeah.
make the decisions that no one wants on their conscience.
But then some people truly do. Um, Throughout the book, like the main character, Loken, this space marine,
Mhm.
he recognizes that, oh, the remembrancers are something bigger than us. They are cataloging the events that happen so people can
Mhm.
look back on the triumphs and the mistakes of the empire. Um, and I think that is a very interesting admission that no one wants him to make. Um,
Yeah.
but I want to go back to gender. Um,
Yes.
what would you describe the not again scandal, but like when people talk about female space marines and how there shouldn't be female space marines, what does that argument usually look like?
Um, I think it's hard to call it an argument, really.
Yeah,
People don't really ever have much of a point other than in the lore, the Emperor made them all men, so therefore they need to be all men for the end of time.
yeah.
Um,
Even throughout the lore, it's inconsistent. Like sometimes they say, "Oh, the gene seed organ women's bodies reject it." Other people
mhm.
say, no, they're super soldiers and men are the strongest, so therefore they would only be men. Why would they pick anyone else? Blah, blah, blah.
I think like if you look back into Games Workshop's past,
Yes.
um, like first off, very early on they did struggle with inclusion
Mm-hmm.
and making models of humans that aren't just white men. Um, which I mean they come unpainted. You can paint them any skin color you want, but often the early representations were exclusively white.
Yeah.
Back to my point, they in one of the very in the very early days of 40K, they did make women space marine models.
Yeah.
Um, but quickly struck them and stopped making them because they were so bad at sculpting the women's faces.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually,
and I don't know.
I know a little bit
Yes,
about this.
yeah,
So,
get more context.
yeah, they were actually part of a line of rogue trader warriors, which
Hmm.
around this point, Space Marines were not as much as a solidified faction as they are now, but they basically had the same body sculpt as a Space Marine. So they're thought to be kind of included as Space Marines. And throughout early White Dwarfs, which were the magazines um, that still come out today that include rules and stories, they actually had fan submissions of custom legions, and they accepted ones that were all women or included mostly women. Um, and so people say, oh, this was the canon at the time, or no, it was just fan submission that was accepted. But um, Games Workshop started as a company that made models for D&D and role-playing games, but their contract was ended, so they started making their own tabletop games that were more board game-like. Um, and so D&D at the time that they were doing this was still primarily men, but not as much as wargaming. Early wargaming was men. So they tried to include a little more women throughout the like girl power era of the 80s. Um, but they just didn't sell as well. And so that was their argument for pulling them, really, was that the female ones didn't sell as well. People could like write down the numbers of the models they saw in the magazine and send them in, and they just weren't bought. And I do think that is some fault of the advertising and just our general perception of what wargaming looks like war, even war video games. Like, we don't see a high female player presence in that. And I don't necessarily want to say it's because women are excluded from the war genre, but more so men are just super pushed into it, is my thoughts on it.
Definitely. I think there's a part of it's just like even if even if Games Workshop made a very big push to market towards women more, um, first off, in today's world, it would be people would immediately go, this is very shallow. The way you're trying to market towards women, but also like there's so much ingrained in people socially, uh, what your gender likes to do, that even in our modern world, it takes a while for these stigmas to be broken.
Yeah. That's actually why I think one of the most like gender inclusive factions is not the all women ones. It is actually, I think, Astra Militarum Guard, which basically they're
Not
very
custodian
much
guard.
no, which is basically the regular military, just
Yep.
humans, and their thing is just that there are so many of them, uh, and they have tanks, and they just try to go up the battlefield. Like, they are, they have a lot of sculpts of different squads, and usually there's like a few women, if not like half and half, in that squad. And they've had multiple, including one big new character of like women leaders as well, in the
Yep.
lore and on tabletop. And I think that's super interesting, and I think people can commentate on our kind of militaristic, ideally, what's the word I want?
Ideological.
Ideological, um, or really just uplifting, um, military or conquest kind of propaganda. But again, I think it's an interesting part of Warhammer.
Yeah.
So I just want to ask you one last question relating back to your gender experience. Um, is there anything within 40K, um, or the adjacent communities that has made you feel super affirmed in your gender?
I don't think that there's like any moment that I think really what affirms me is that it doesn't come up.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people not familiar as much with like trans and gender advocacy, um, don't realize is although it does feel great to be celebrated and recognized, um, it's really tiring if that's all that keeps happening and it just keeps, people keep being like, "You're trans. This is so amazing." Wow, you don't want these
yeah,
massive reactions to your existence whenever you enter a room. You want to enter a room and be treated like everyone else who enters that room.
yeah.
Um,
And I think that's similar to, we had a discussion about like rainbow capitalism and just overemphasis on identity versus actually feeling humanized.
yeah.
Is there anything else you want to talk about today?
Um, there was just one thing I thought of when you talked about the all women armies, and I had
Yeah.
another point towards that where I think it's funny and sad to point out how the most major all women army, the one that you started with,
Yeah.
the Sisters of Battle Adeptus Sororitas, started when they were first introduced. So as we know them today, they came out around 2018.
Yeah, the
Um,
modern plastic line of them
yeah, they
before
all came out
plastic was
within
metal.
the last decade. Um, and they kind of reshaped a lot of what they looked like. Um, Back in the early days of the
Yeah.
faction, they were highly sexualized. Um, they were, instead of armor, they were given robes, some of which were very low cut. And the theming of like penance and self-flagellation existed then, but it felt more in service of
Yes.
taking more of the robe off.
Yeah.
Uh, there's one particular model that I think a lot of people bring up where there are these things called the penitence engines that
You can start again.
I can start again.
Mm.
So before the computer rudely cut me off, um, I was on the penitent engines where the modern day interpretation of them, they are either these sarcophaguses or just like these metal shells,
Hmm.
where basically the person inside, they are forced to rush into combat, and if they are lucky enough to survive, that is a miracle from the emperor, and they are absolved of their sins. And the early version of this is a woman in robes who is like strapped by her arms and ankles, in a very
Yeah.
exposed position. Um, and I think this is not only like it shows how much we've grown in such a short time, but also like I think partially exhibits why, not that we haven't had other reasons why the hobby is viewed as the way it is, being so masculine. You know, I think
Yeah. And I'm
it's
definitely gonna get into podcast sculpts more in a future episode. Um,
definitely.
yeah. But it
I just
has
thought,
been a problem.
yeah, I thought it was something that would be interesting to bring up with us talking about, how
Yeah.
the all women armies aren't really the ones that women gravitate
Yeah.
to, and that's part of the reason why.
For sure. I just want to say thank you for doing this with me
Of
and
course.
sitting down and talking about yourself, mostly Warhammer, but some about yourself too.
Yeah,
Um, and I hope you had a good time.
I
Uh,
did.
this is where I'm going to let people plug themselves. I know you don't really have too much of an internet presence, but
No, I exist.
yeah. Well, thanks for hopping into the Bitz Box with me.
Of course.
See you later.